You're unmuted, Presby.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Ooh, an extended version. Well, say what you will about humanitarian organizations, which may or may not now also own consignment shops, but you don't hear Goodwill pumping out jams like that. So thank you to the Salvation Army and Good News for the intro tunes tonight. Again, we're, I guess, a good music playing show now. We're just going to have to adjust to that, and everyone else will as well. But welcome to Presbycast. I'm Presbyterian, Chortles Weekly, and our guest, and this is the Life and Liberty episode, where we'll obviously be talking about those two things, among many others. So, Chortles, how are you?
I'm good. Now, I think that tune that we just heard was from 1973, the year of the founding of the PCA. So, if that dates anything or anyone, it may be 70. But it's in that range. Can't look it up right now, but yeah, that one was for you, Resby, because that's sort of your energy level. People might not believe that, but that's what I'm going to say.
All right.
So our guest is Kerry Baldwin. She's a writer and podcaster, and she works with the Christian Libertarian Institute. And she does small group training on critical thinking and probably some other things too. So, Kerry, if you'll unmute yourself and say hello, we'll welcome you in.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, 2022 is 2 years after 2020. And,
I was told there would be no math on this show.
Yeah. Well, it's short math. Lots of digits, though, I guess. A lot of people never really thought about issues of liberty, government intrusion into their lives, that sort of thing. Is there anybody who hasn't thought about that in the last 2 years, and what's wrong with them if they haven't? And what's the state of the liberty movement, which is not to say a libertarian party, but the movement and the principles of liberty and their place in the conversation and people's thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that the Overton window has definitely moved, shifted. I think that there are more people who are contemplating these questions of freedom and the role of the state and civil governance and how the church should respond to that, for sure. The liberty movement, I would say, is alive and well. We are we're hammering home the messages that we've been talking about for decades. Of course, I would say that the thing in the forefront of everybody's mind right now is probably inflation and monetary policy, what's happening economically. But we also have news with regards to things like the vaccines and COVID and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think this is a prime opportunity. I've said before that I think that we have a prime opportunity to really make change towards liberty. And I'm optimistic. So,
Well, some people think, when they think of libertarians, they think of sort of nerds on the spectrum who just want to be able to take drugs, legalize marijuana, do
That's
anything they want, and
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
well, says you, Resby. But sort of slyly cleaned up hippies, maybe, or maybe kind of dark, shadowy, creepy, alt something, this or that. But
we're pot smokers who know economics.
oh,
Just
okay.
kidding.
Well,
I'm just kidding.
well, and the economic angle is harder to understand than my kids can't go to school or I have to get this shot.
Right.
But explaining how we got to the economic state that we're in now is more difficult than those other issues. But it's all together. But I should say I follow these issues closely enough to know that although we're not talking about a party necessarily, we're talking about the principles of liberty and how those can be applied in the civil sphere and in government, and really in other spheres too. But we're not talking about a party. But the Libertarian Party, is not the same Libertarian Party it was 4, 6, 8, 10, 20 years ago. It has been, I think, it seems to have been taken over by the Mises Caucus. That would mean something to some people and not anything to others.
Right.
But let's say that there are the more, and I use this word loosely, conservative, to the right, than the stereotypical image of sort of what has been politically a loser Libertarian Party. So you want to say a couple of things about that, and what effect that might have on the next couple of election cycles.
Yeah, well, if anybody in your audience remembers the the presidential campaigns of Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, that's Mises Caucus. And I suppose another little bit of information that's valuable is that the Libertarian Party has always been sort of split between what you might call pragmatists and idealists. And the Ron Paul people, or the Mises Caucus people, as I guess we can call them now, are much more idealistic, much more honed in on the philosophy of libertarianism and sticking to those principles as consistently as possible. While the pragmatist side, which is they're the ones who've really held power for quite a while. The pragmatist side is more interested in just trying to play the political game. And if they have to sacrifice some principles, then so be it. So if anybody remembers the 2016 presidential election.
That was so long ago.
I know. It feels so long ago.
That was the longest quarter of a quarter century that I've ever experienced.
Right. Yeah. So the Libertarian Party ticket in 2016 was Gary Johnson and a guy named Bill Weld, and that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of libertarians who, were sort of hoping that the Libertarian Party would make major party status, but they kept on making these sacrifices with principle, and Bill Weld was a huge sacrifice. So at any rate, what happened this year at the Libertarian Party convention was, well, two major things, I would say. First of all, the Mises Caucus did successfully take over the party. They occupy every single elected seat in the National Party.
I should interject. That caucus is named after Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian
Yes.
economist.
Yep. And and then the other major thing that they did was they removed the abortion plank from their platform, which is very significant. I have an article. It's pinned to my Twitter profile. It's also on the Libertarian Christian Institute, but it basically goes through the history of the abortion plank. And I guess I'll say just this about it. The idea that libertarians have always been pro-choice is not actually true. And if you go through and you read the history of that plank, you'll begin to see why. But basically, they were trying to figure out how to reconcile women's rights with children's rights. And so there was a constant or near constant, seemed constant for a political party back and forth with that. And so eventually this year, they voted to just remove it altogether because there have always been pro-life libertarians, whether in the party or just in principle. And, they've had a reasonable argument against abortion from a libertarian perspective. And so that abortion plank was actually creating a lot of division within the party for pro-lifers in particular. And there was a lot of liberty-loving people who might otherwise, really vote for a libertarian or run as a libertarian or get involved as a libertarian if it weren't for that plank. And so the pro-life, what do they call it? I think the pro-life Libertarian Caucus was instrumental in getting that piece removed. So those were the two major things that happened with the LP this year.
But before we get into the abortion issue, give your elevator speech for why Christians can now. I mean, if abortion was the barrier previously, can or should take a look at, again, maybe not joining a party, because there are a lot of small L libertarians that don't like the large L libertarian party.
Yep.
But why should they take a look at the libertarians, and what's the benefit to Christians, and how or if or is are the principles of liberty compatible with Christian convictions?
Yeah. So the basic principles of libertarianism are two basic principles. One is the principle of self-ownership, which is the idea that you own yourself. And of course, there are Christians who would rebuff that idea because there's a scripture in the Bible that says you are not your own, you are bought with a price. So in response to that, I would say as a Christian libertarian that God absolutely owns me and owns everybody else. So in relation to God, I'm only a self-steward. He gives us a stewardship or a responsibility over our body and over our lives. In relation to others, we own ourselves. In other words, nobody else has a higher claim on our body or life than somebody else. And what that means for liberty, that goes into the next principle, which is the non-aggression principle. And that says that you may not initiate aggression or coercion against another person or their property. And so that's called the non-aggression principle. And the only legitimate use of force would be in self-defense, in response to an act of aggression. So those are the two basic principles. And basically what this means for Christians is you don't have somebody else telling you, when you can go to church, or if you have to wear a mask, or how to educate your children, or, any number of things that the state actually tries to compel, coerce, or tell you what to do otherwise. So there's a great deal of freedom in that. And liberty is most definitely a theme in Christianity. I would say
Yeah, and
that,
it's an underrated theme
yeah,
because almost. I mean, it's held up as the goal, for the
mm,
children of Israel in the Old Testament. But almost any time freedom and liberty are mentioned in the Bible or implied, it's in a very positive
mm,
a framework, and really it's slavery to sin or to unjust rulers or to some conquering power. That's always presented. That's the opposite of freedom and liberty, and that's always. I mean, it does say that we're slaves of Christ and
sure.
slaves of God. That's fine. But when it's between people, when it's between persons or groups or nations, subjugation is never extolled. It's always the result of sin or evil or some combination of the two. It's complicated.
Yeah, well, the founding one of the founding principles, you might say, of classical liberalism was religious freedom, which started in the Protestant Reformation, or it's credited that way. So this is very much in our own history as Reformed Christians, and yes, the Bible speaks quite a bit about liberty and freedom of conscience, and even that idea that we are slaves to Christ. Um, that's it's it is to say that we are free in Christ, right? By being a slave to Christ, He frees us from the yoke of sin and slavery and so forth. So, yeah, I think that there are very good reasons why Christians can be libertarians. And I'll go ahead and plug our book. I'm a co-author with some of my colleagues from LCI on a book called Faith Seeking Freedom, Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. We answer 101 tough questions that we get asked as Christian libertarians. And this is everything from what does the Bible say about civil governance and resistance to, um, topical issues like ethics and abortion and environmentalism and war and the whole gamut. So you can find it on Amazon. It's a super easy read.
It seems like today that some progressive evangelicals, and this, of course, this has always been the case with the main line, but they've never met an expansion of government or a large program or a government mandate that they don't like. And so it hit me sometime in the last couple of years that you can advocating for liberty, general liberty for people, reasonable liberty, when at all possible, is or can be a form of loving your neighbor. Now we've been trained out of that idea. I think we have the idea that some people can't, they can't possibly make good decisions for themselves, and they don't deserve to have the freedom. But I think that's not so. I mean, you can probably overdo it in any direction, but it's possible to advocate generally for liberty and adopt some of these principles and do it out of love for neighbor, and it actually have good effects for your neighbor.
Yeah, well, the role of civil governance has to do with legal coercion. What are we saying that the state or the civil magistrate can actually use force in enforcing? And so when somebody says, and this happens on the right and the left, but when somebody says there should be a law, what we're saying is, some a government agent should use force against you or threaten to put you in a cage if you don't do what I think you should do. That's fundamentally what that's about. And there are Christians on the left and the right who have no problem using the state against liberty. And I would say that both sides err in trying to get the state or civil governance to fulfill the two greatest commandments, right? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So the right tries to compel love of God through law, and through certain laws, not all laws, but and the left tends to compel love of neighbor through the law. And I think it's absolutely true what you say, Resby, is, or excuse me, Charles.
No. If it was something good, attribute it to me.
I constantly refer to Resby by my dog's name by accident, so that's fine.
No, you constantly refer to your dog by my name.
Well, I do think it is loving to give people the freedom of choice, and just because there's a freedom to make a choice doesn't mean that you're going to make the right choice, and it doesn't mean that giving that choice means that you endorse the wrong choice, right? But certainly giving that freedom to choose is a loving thing. I mean, God gave Adam and Eve the choice in the garden, right? And they chose poorly, but we can't say that giving the freedom of choice is a bad thing, because that would create a problem for Scripture.
Well, I think we mentioned it long ago in one of the 2020 shows. That was really just one long episode of us griping about still being stuck as we were. But the choice in how we love our neighbor is we've once, and I think the power of the "Who's My Neighbor" parable is the fact that we're constantly looking way too far in the distance for who our neighbor is, and we're still missing the people who are in our homes who need that as well. And so when Scripture talks about woe to the man who sells everything to donate it at the expense of his own family, I think we saw people forcing other people to do that very thing. Is you have to give all of this up, even if it hurts your family, for some neighbor, for just the idea of, rather than the actual thing. And that's why I think those, the Biden memes of like, hey man, I can't feed my family, and he's like, sorry, Jack. Like it's absurd, but it nails the point. Is when we lose who our neighbor is, and I think, and again, like I said, the reason why those parables speak so powerfully is because we're always confusing who our neighbor is. It's not this big
Resby,
significant thing.
Fauci is your neighbor. Okay, don't forget that.
I'm so glad I can social distance from him, at least. Although, like Fauci, if somebody wants to get a bobblehead made of me, I will display it in my office. So I am that humble.
Everyone says so. All right, so we've covered some of the basic things. I know you've, Kerry, have spent a lot of time on this issue of abortion, and some people say, well, why do we need to talk about this? Because the Bible says we shouldn't murder, and in a few places it actually mentions, not by using the word abortion, but the killing of an unborn child, and that's wrong, and you shouldn't do it. Church has always agreed with that, and not every person who's ever been in the church. Certainly the early Christians supposedly were known for saving exposed infants and taking in orphans, and that's always been part of our conviction. I say always, I mean almost always, and almost everyone, of course. But you've done a lot of work on this, but some people would say, well, why? The Bible says murder's wrong, killing's wrong, abortion's wrong. But you've done this work to tell us why you have done it. Why is it important that even those who have libertarian principles, I think you want to show them that it's okay to be against abortion, and you do that for the good of your neighbor.
Yeah. So I guess one thing that I'm doing with this whole thing Well, I'll start here. In 2019, I had put out a couple of podcast episodes just talking about a libertarian view of abortion and applying these principles of self-ownership and non-aggression to pregnancy, reproductive rights, that sort of thing. And so I was invited by the Soho Forum, which is a libertarian organization. They're sponsored by Reason Magazine. I was invited by them to go out to New York City and debate a PhD economist by the name of Walter Block. And Walter Block is basically he's basically the guy to beat on this topic. He's had his theory of what's called evictionism since about 1977. And so there's a few reasons why I'm doing this research and trying to articulate a pro-life libertarian theory of abortion and more broadly reproductive rights. And there's two reasons. Number one, I genuinely believe that libertarian philosophy is necessarily pro-life. And when I say necessarily pro-life, when we talk about the principle of self-ownership, we're talking about something that is inherent in humanity. And if it's inherent in humanity and not given to us by anybody else, then it's got to have a starting point. We need to be able to establish that. And so far, we haven't established that, not just within libertarianism, but human rights theories, broadly speaking. So that was number one. But number two, I really wanted to speak to the pro-life movement, what I call the conventional pro-life movement, because we sort of, with the moral argument, right? We know that we've got the moral argument, we've got the moral high ground on this, which basically says, look, since abortion is murder, and we know it's murder, then we simply outlaw abortion as thoroughly as possible. And that's the solution to the problem, right? And in all of this, in all of the politics and the rhetoric and the activism and so forth, we talk about ending abortion now or abolishing abortion, or this idea that we can eliminate it somehow from society. And certainly I think that's the goal. But what I'm focusing on is sort of a different set of questions. On the libertarian side, we're asking this question, how do we actually account for why abortion is murder, right? It's one thing to say, well, that's a human being and you're killing it. Like, yes, we agree with that. But if you look at most of the pro-life legislation out there right now, even these trigger bans that have gone into effect since the overturn of Roe, those bans don't start until the heartbeat. And so, that's essentially an arbitrary starting point. Is that is that a good way to actually judge whether or not that's a human life? So this question, how do we actually account for why abortion is murder, is a question that pro-lifers, conventional pro-lifers, really haven't grappled with a whole lot. It's always been the moral argument. It's always been sort of reactive to the pro-choice side. And we need a legal theory in order to parse that out and really say where, rights are for the woman and rights are for the fetus and what are they and that sort of thing. So that's one question that I'm answering with this theory. The other side of that coin, though, the end abortion or abolish abortion now sort of sentiment, the other side of that coin is, how do you end the practice of abortion? And there's not a consensus. There's a great deal of disagreement about this question of ending the practice of abortion. There are some pro-lifers who acknowledge that criminalizing it won't end it, but that's okay. We're just going to throw them in prison and be done with it. Whoever it is, just the abortion doctor or the woman, and even that's a question, right? And that's something that a legal theory needs to parse out as well. But in libertarian theory, we have the economic element. And that is dealing with something called praxeology, which is the study of human action. And this is something that actually, if we use it, if we leverage it, we can answer questions about why women seek abortions to begin with and respond to it in economic ways that persuade women to not seek out abortion to begin with, to voluntarily choose life.
Which is what some of the pro-life movement does now, with crisis pregnancy centers, adoption assistance, economic support, all those things.
Yeah, and crisis pregnancy centers are absolutely wonderful. I'm a huge advocate of them. They have sort of, in the past 50 years, they've been that piece of the puzzle, though, that has mitigated this sort of practical question: how do we end the practice of abortion? It's mitigated that in the broader conversation, because the broader conversation has always been centered around legality and Roe v. Wade and what does the court say, right? But now what we're going to find with the overturn of Roe, we are already seeing this, is the economic aspect, the black market or gray markets. What do you do for a woman who's traveling out of state to go get an abortion legally in a different state? All of those questions are economic questions, and that is where a lot of my work has been one on the legal rights question. What are the rights? What are the rights of the woman? What are the rights of the fetus? And then how does economics and praxeology actually give us information about how to encourage women to voluntarily choose life? And then the third piece is the enforcement question, which is actually, if you're going to have abortion prohibition, you have to have enforcement of that. And I would say that where there are disputes between pro-choicers and pro-lifers, it has largely to do with how it's going to be enforced. So that's another piece of the puzzle. So really what I'm, aside from being able to tell libertarians, hey, this is a pro-life philosophy, like necessarily it's not a, hey, if you feel like getting an abortion or you don't feel like getting an abortion, that's up to you. But I want to speak to conventional pro-lifers and say, look, the complicated nature of this is necessary to understand if we are going to actually end as much as possible the practice of abortion. We don't want to be looking at this through a myopic lens. So that I think that answers the question about why I'm doing it.
All right. So, what are your arguments? I mean, do they hinge on the libertarian idea of property or self-ownership more? I mean, because I know, you might want to explain the traditional libertarian position that was, informed by the idea of evictionism, which meant they basically portrayed the unborn child as a squatter and who could be evicted by the landlord.
Yeah.
So that's the property aspect, and then there's the issue of self. I'm sure both of those things come in.
Yeah, so self-ownership is actually, well, let me start it this way. It was Murray Rothbard who suggested that we use property rights to articulate human rights. So when we talk about property rights, we're still talking about a human right. If I go exchange money for groceries, that food is mine. That's a human right. But so when we talk about self-ownership, we're still talking about a property right. It's a property right in myself. And so it is it is the quintessential property right. So my argument has to do with claiming, my argument has to do with something I called fetal self-ownership. So it's applying this principle of self-ownership to the fetus and saying, when does the fetus become a rights-bearing individual? When does the fetus become a self-owner? Now, what Walter Block did was to say, and Murray Rothbard did this too, to some extent. Murray Rothbard tried to argue that the fetus was a parasite, although that was much more pejorative than biological. But what Walter Block did was to say, well, if I have a house, right, and there's somebody else inside my house, and I don't want them there, then I have the right to kick them out. I have the right to evict them, right? But I don't have a right to kill them. And so he basically took that analogy and he applied it to the situation with the womb. And this was most pro-lifers, when I describe that to them, they are like, that's absolutely absurd. But his motivation for doing that was, like I said, to parse out or attempt to parse out what the actual rights are between the woman and the fetus. And if libertarians are one thing, they are staunch advocates of bodily autonomy and agency, and so am I, quite frankly. But so what I do with the argument is I argue that a fetus meets the conditions for self-ownership from the moment conception is complete. It's at that point scientifically that a fetus is autonomous and self-organizing. Its whole development is self-driven from the moment conception is complete. And that's roughly 3 days after fertilization. So it's not quite this moment of conception. We have new information. It doesn't take place in a moment. It's a process that takes roughly 3 days. And so I'm looking for the two conditions for self-ownership, which is, one, you have to be a human, and two, you have to have possession of yourself or direct and immediate control over yourself. It's at that point at conception that now development is driven by the genetic instructions of the embryo. And there are other conditions, by the way, that are also met for it just being a living organism.
Yeah, well, and just being, I think common sense tells us that simply being dependent on someone else doesn't mean that you lose your rights.
Right.
If that were the case, everyone on life support, we would just unplug them if it were convenient. The end of the pre-birth human and his or her rights is very much like the oldest or most vulnerable because of injury or disability humans as well. It's a mirror image almost.
Yeah, every single argument that has been used to claim that the fetus either doesn't have rights or has lesser rights than the woman, if you were to apply any of those arguments to born humans, then you suddenly get all of these marginalized groups in society that have had their rights violated before. So it's interesting that the fetus is actually representative in some fashion of all of mankind, because it can be disabled, it can be female, it can be black, it can be white, it can be all of the things that have been used or reasons again that have been used to discriminate against somebody and violate their rights. The fetus in some way represents that. So I think it is, well, let me say this. One thing that I think we haven't done, not just libertarians, but philosophers generally, when it comes to a theory of human rights, is we tend to think about human rights in terms of man's rights, like man qua man. And that's sort of your generic rights. And then we try to apply that to women and offspring, and it doesn't quite work. What I'm suggesting is, if we actually pay attention to mankind qua woman, right, and mankind qua offspring, then we can get a clearer picture of what human rights are. Because if we're really honest with ourselves, none of the theories of human rights right now are consistent, because they do not account for the rights of women and children. And these, by the way, happen to be the two groups that the state is ready and willing to exploit in a crisis, is women and children. And so it really is a necessity for us to have a comprehensive theory of human rights that reconciles the rights between man, woman, and offspring.
All right. So, how are these ideas? How are they being received in the libertarian movement? I mean, do you see progress, or are people open to these ideas?
Yeah. So I would say, when I talk to people, what I find is most people are in this gray middle, right? When in the conventional debate, you have this single data point that pro-choicers and pro-lifers both use and sort of twist. And that is that 61% of Americans support legal abortion in the first trimester. So pro-choicers will take that data point and say, look, a majority of Americans are pro-choice. And then the pro-lifers take that same data point and say, look, a majority of Americans want restrictions on abortion. And that just muddles the whole thing. I think a majority of Americans are actually in this gray middle. They understand it's a complicated issue, and that the conventional debate has not actually offered good solutions for the legitimate criticisms on both sides. And neither side is willing to give any ground. It's incredibly polarized. So the people that I talk to when I'm presenting my argument are people in the middle who may lean pro-choice, they may lean pro-life. My view is incredibly popular with that gray middle who's looking for real answers and is tired of the polarized debate and the rhetoric and the intractability of the whole thing. So I'd say it's well received, and I've gotten people who have said, "Well, I was pro-choice by default because this is just too complicated of an issue, and now you've gotten me off of that, and I'm pro-life now." I've talked to pro-lifers who were much more militant and feeling like you have to throw down the hammer, so to speak. I've gotten them to understand and appreciate my perspective on this. So, it's also growing, believe it or not, in South America, in Latin-speaking or Spanish-speaking countries. I get lots of people who are very attracted to it. So I would say it is popular as far as the people who hear it. When they hear it, it makes them think, and it addresses the concerns on both sides, and is not emotionally charged. If you've ever seen any of my debates, especially the debate with Walter Block, they're very peaceable and not not your typical abortion debate.
Well, I think it's impossible to separate abortion from the idea that people just want to be able to do whatever they want to do, and that fallen humanity is just inherently materialist, and really pragmatic. They want things. We want things, and we want them now. So, I mean, does your argument have anything to say to them?
Well, I would say this is where the praxeology part comes in, right? Because I'm not a materialist, and libertarianism isn't a materialist philosophy. But when we look at what people want, right, we're looking at preferences. And that's a legitimate thing. So one thing that I say is that unplanned pregnancy is not a moral failure. And it's also not a natural failure, as in, you're a victim of nature because you got pregnant and didn't plan on it. Not wanting to be pregnant is a completely legitimate preference. And the issue or the question at hand is, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with an unwanted pregnancy or a crisis pregnancy? And our society has, by and large, told women that the thing that makes them women, which is the capacity to make babies, is actually a very real problem for them. Feminists talk about women as though they're victims of nature. And I'm not the only one who says this. There are several feminists out there that are now speaking against that idea that women are victims of nature. But by and large, the feminist movement has said, it's harder for you when a woman gets pregnant, they carry the greater cost of the pregnancy. And so the fact that a woman would not want to carry that cost, whatever it is, could be financial, could be health, could be, whatever, relational, if you're in a bad relationship. A woman recognizing that isn't a bad thing, right? So from an economic perspective, what we want to have is options available to her, not just as alternatives to the unplanned pregnancy itself, although we do want that. And that's where, adoption agencies come in, crisis pregnancy centers come in, and that sort of thing. But her decision-making process actually starts way before that, way before she gets pregnant, way before she has sex, way before she gets into a relationship. There's not a lot of teaching women how to make these choices, how to make risk assessments, how to think about their future and that sort of thing. And yet they are making decisions intuitively towards that direction. So, I don't think that we need to really say, well, we need to fight these materialists or these people that want everything now. What we need to do is leverage the market. And the market is just the exchange of goods and services between individuals, right?
So would you propose? I mean, you're talking about education, I guess, but would that be done by the state, or would that be done by
no
independent? Yeah. So anyone listening to you might think, well, this just sounds like we need government programs, do good or great society programs to, just to teach people a better way.
Yeah. And I don't think that the state should do any of this. In fact, quite frankly, one of the reasons why we're in the predicament that we're in is because the state has so much control over public education. And that drives, the model of public education even drives the model and curriculum for homeschooling and private schooling and that sort of thing. So, one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we are in is because, for example, sex education programs are written by Planned Parenthood. And that's a problem. Now, when I talk about education, I'm talking about, obtaining knowledge, right? A woman learning that she has agency over her body and she has control over her body. And that she's responsible for her body. That's a great deal of power. But if you don't teach her how to use that and make good decisions, then that becomes her greatest vulnerability. And that's what we end up seeing. And what you see in the conventional abortion debate is both sides look at women as victims. You're either a victim of nature, in which case you need the state to legalize abortion so that you can kill your fetus because you didn't plan very well. And we can get into rape if you want to. Or on the conventional side, you have, well, she's a victim of circumstance or she's a victim of a relationship, which I'm not saying isn't legitimate. That can absolutely be legitimate, but it sort of undermines any of the choices that she had that might have prevented, the poverty or the bad relationship or whatnot. And so she needs somebody else to make decisions for her or for women in general, so that they don't find themselves in those situations. Instead, we should be talking about the woman learning how, or the teenage girl learning how to make decisions about her body, so that she can prevent those things, or as much as she can mitigate those things.
I assume you would say that the religious teachings of abstinence and prioritizing marriage and family are the best way to prevent abortion or the need for it or the desire for it. But also, I would think that having a federal government that didn't incentivize single motherhood for reasons, for economic reasons, that would be helpful too.
So, yeah, I actually think that if we follow the praxeology through to its logical conclusion, then we have an argument from nature, essentially, that marriage is the best situation to be in if you're going to get pregnant and have babies, right? So yes, there's the religious argument, and of course I affirm that. But following out the logic through to its logical conclusion, I think we actually see why that's true. And I'm hoping to parse that out in the paper that I submit. The same thing with abstinence only. I think the only sort of caveat that I would make to that is that Christians and people in general need to have a conversation about sex, right? Because not having a conversation about sex can actually lead to a number of abuses, and people who are vulnerable don't even realize that they've wound up in an abusive situation because they didn't have those conversations. So again, within, this is parents teaching kids, or, maybe the parents are part of a co-op or whatever. I'm not advocating that the state teaches sex education. But again, there should be a conversation about that. Abstinence turns out to be the lowest, the action with the lowest risk when it comes to getting pregnant and dealing with unplanned pregnancy. But by having the conversation about sex, we can also say, okay, look, you're taking a risk by doing this, right? We can introduce risk assessment into that conversation. We can say, okay, this is something you want to do. Can you afford to do this? And helping young people ask those questions about themselves. A teenage boy and a teenage girl who have hormones raging, right, end up having sex, and then she gets pregnant, and he's shocked, right? This can happen with adults too. And he wants to keep the baby and she doesn't, right? Well, he's just lost out because he's not married to her. So why are we not having this conversation about risk assessment and saying, look, if this happens, what do you want to have happen if she gets pregnant? Right? We aren't having those conversations. We aren't saying, let's talk about risk. Let's talk about trade-offs. Let's talk about these other things. Oh, it turns out that being in a committed relationship, having some sort of legally binding contract, those sorts of things assure, which we call marriage, at least in the economic and legal sense, having those things in place are a good thing, and they're protective of both father and mother. So that's a conversation that should be had. I think it's not had enough in Christian circles, at least. So yes, I'm absolutely an advocate of a Christian sexual ethic, that it's only for marriage and that you should remain abstinence until marriage. But having that conversation why, as to why, is very, very important.
Well, and you're talking about we're talking about neighbors here. We're not talking about people in the church necessarily. I think what you're talking about is equipping people who have not yet come into the church and who may never, to even for them to be able to avoid this, tragedy of abortion. And you're, I think someone in the live chat said they didn't really understand, what programs you were advocating or actions, and what legal strategy you were advocating. So if you want to try to, summarize that simply, because you're smart and you're a philosopher, which doesn't all, you don't do sound bites, Kerry.
I don't do sound bites. This is true. So a libertarian perspective on this is that the government isn't involved in education. The government isn't involved in economic regulation. The government's sole purpose is to adjudicate disputes and to administer restitution when rights violations are made. So what that means as far as, programs or responses on a societal level, that's all things that would be considered economic, in the sense of, maybe you have a nonprofit organization or that works closely with a crisis pregnancy center, for example, a private organization that comes up with a curriculum that you can, that private schools can use, that homeschoolers can use, that, whomever. And that's not the only organization. That organization is going to compete with other organizations who have their ideas about how to respond to that, how to answer those questions. So that's what I'm talking about. I don't think it should be, and libertarians would say this, that it shouldn't be coerced by the state. It shouldn't be planned by the state. When the state gets involved, they muck it up. And so we don't want that to be. And actually, by having, you would inevitably have organizations, unless it's, well, let me just say this, you will inevitably have organizations that are more pro-choice or pro-abortion, and some that are pro-life, anti-abortion. And so you would have that competitive aspect, which is central to economics. But that competitive aspect is really important because the market, which is, you and me, we're responding to what's put out there. We're consuming it. We're the consumers. And when the government gets involved in that, when they get involved with regulation, they actually take our power away from us to regulate the market ourselves. In fact, women are the primary consumers in the economy, and there's a very good reason for that. And that has to do with the fact that we're the ones who are raising the next generation. So when we have the power to choose from a number of different options in the market, we send signals to those producers about what it is that we want. And the argument from a libertarian perspective is that a freed market is going to maximize those things that are high quality and cost effective and ethical and life affirming, right? A dangerous medical procedure is not going to last very long in a market where there's 10 other procedures that do the same thing but is more safe, right? So the idea here is not to get the government involved in regulating how that's going to work and saying, we want to have a culture that is abstinence only and holds marriage sacred and that sort of thing. And so these are the policies that we're going to implement. We've tried that. It doesn't work. It backfires. And it also just creates it creates a punching bag for the other party to come back, and they punch that bag. So by leaving it to the market, where we're leaving it to a process that is inspired by innovation and competition, and like I said, maximizes the highest quality product or service at the lowest cost, and is more ethical and life affirming, like that grows out of the innovation. So I hope that answers the question.
Would there be any place for laws against abortion? There are
Sure.
laws against murder. So I think a listener has a question about, so what would the legal strategy be? Of course, again, with Roe being overturned, it's down to the states now, and so that really does give individuals, every one of us, a much better chance to have an impact on the laws and the elected officials and the scope of government in our states, which are much smaller than the country as a whole. So it's brought the issue closer.
Yeah, and I think one thing that this overturn of Roe is going to really bring to the surface is this distinction between legal and economic. So can a libertarian society, or would a libertarian society prohibit abortion as it's murder? Yes, that can happen. Absolutely. One of the things that is rising to the surface, though, right now is, what is it exactly that you're banning or legally prohibiting? Is it the D&C procedure? Is it the abortion pill? Like, is there a prohibition against purchasing that? That's an economic regulation. And actually, the way the laws are written right now is a woman who obtains, say, mifepristone, which is one of the abortion pills. There are 2 abortion pills, but that's one of them. If she obtains that and she administers it herself, the way the laws are written is she's not going to be charged with murder. So, in a libertarian society, if we were implementing my theory as I'm describing it, the action of initiating aggression against the fetus would be legally prohibited, right? And that actually holds the woman responsible for having the abortion. This would exclude miscarriages. If you guys want to talk about that, we can. But what we're seeing right now is this attempt to, they're called bans, but they're really economic prohibitions. You can't purchase it, or you can't sell the service, is really how that's working out. You can't be an abortion doctor selling the service.
So you're saying that the legal, framework regime that you would propose would actually be more restrictive, or maybe more punitive to those, not just the institutions and the doctors, but it right down to the individual level.
Yeah, we can get into enforcement, but the distinction that I'm trying to make here is that in a libertarian society, it wouldn't be that a D&C or an abortion pill is banned. Those are procedures or products that are used for other things as well. I think mifepristone was used for like cancer or something like that, and the other drug, misoprostol, I think is how you pronounce it, is used for ulcers. So they have other uses. So you wouldn't actually, in a libertarian society, those drugs wouldn't be banned. You could still get them. A woman could still, illegally take an abortion. When I say illegally, she's the act of ingesting those pills would be that act of murder, right? So I'm drawing that out because in a libertarian legal order, those goods and services wouldn't be legally prohibited. A D&C is used for delivering an already dead baby in certain miscarriage situations, where the body doesn't, where the woman's body doesn't expel the fetus. So in a libertarian legal order, what you're looking at is the action that the woman takes against her fetus, right? That's what would be legally prohibited. So in some sense, yes, it's a much, I would say it's a much more precise way of looking at the law that would be written. Before I get into the punitive aspect, does that answer the question as far as what would be criminalized?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Maybe someone was assuming that because, in a libertarian society, there just wouldn't be laws against anything, which is actually not true.
Not true. Yeah. The non-aggression principle is the basis from which we would identify rights violations, and rights violations would be considered illegal. So, murder is a rights violation, theft is a rights violation, rape is a rights violation. And there wouldn't be, I can say this, there probably wouldn't be a law that says abortion is illegal. It would just be, initiating the demise of your fetus. Initiating the demise of your fetus is murder. It would just be categorized under murder. So as far as enforcement is concerned, that's another place where I'm quite a bit nuanced. So the way that our system operates right now is it's a system of justice that is largely a product of tough on crime policies, war on drug policies, that sort of thing. We have principles written into the Constitution that are they're not really practiced anymore. I mean, they are practiced to a degree, but not as much as they should be, or not as strictly as they should be. And that has a lot to do with just these policies that have come through as a consequence of the war on drugs and tough on crime policies, which I'll just say are totally a product of Joe Biden. But so the idea with our current criminal system is, if you commit a crime, let's say Resby steals Chortle's TV, right?
That's why I have it tied down.
That's why he got the
Right.
dog.
If there's a crime between the two, right? What the state does is the state comes in and the state considers that crime as a crime against the state, not a crime against Chortles. And so then you have all of these other possibilities. Like if you get a conviction, then, you might go to jail. You might, have to, there's a number of things that are sort of listed out in the law. But the idea is these punishments are supposed to create a deterrence effect, which means, okay, if you know what the punishment's going to be, then that's going to deter you from committing the crime. That's going to deter Resby from stealing Chortle's TV. And what we actually find, there was a study done in Canada, the United States, and Australia, looking at these tough on crime policies, and they actually found that it doesn't create a deterrence effect. It also doesn't reduce recidivism, which is repeat offenses. So, part of the other idea is they go, somebody goes to jail for a crime, and when they get out, they should have learned their lesson, so they never do that again. That doesn't actually bear out. People who get out of prison are just as likely to recommit that crime, and a lot of people end up doing that. So there's no deterrence effect, and there's no reduction in recidivism rates from our system. The other problem with our system is that it costs the victim the victim doesn't actually get restitution. Any restitution is really just, the state getting satisfaction and in having a conviction. So the reason why I bring all of this,
and funding the massive, court and prosecutorial system.
yeah, the other component is that our criminal justice system, as it exists today, number one, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. And number two, taxpayers are paying for that, and it's perpetually more and more expensive. So our criminal justice system doesn't do what it says it's supposed to do, and it costs taxpayers exorbitant amounts of money, and it also doesn't actually seek restitution for the victim. So lots of problems. I bring that up because in a libertarian legal order, if we had our way, in a libertarian legal order, there's really there might be more, but the two kinds of enforcement that I focus on are tort law and something called restorative justice. Both of those, tort law is something that we already use in civil courts. This is, if you, I don't know, damage somebody's property, right? You can sue them civilly and get financial restitution. That's a tort. And then there's restorative justice, which, I can talk about in a minute. But both of those forms of enforcement actually produce deterrence when you know the cost of your crime, not the punishment of your crime, but when you know how much you're going to pay if you get caught. That actually does produce deterrence. And it also lowers recidivism rates. So that's something that we want. So I would say when it comes to punishment for abortion, for example, I wouldn't be looking, I don't advocate for the criminal justice system that we have. And that's really not, libertarians are looking for restitution when it comes to justice. So what I'm looking at is tort law and restorative justice, particularly restorative justice. This is a model which is really interesting. They use it in Longmont, Colorado. They've used it for the past 2 decades. And what's interesting about restorative justice is that it encourages responsibility. It encourages the offending party, or the responsible party is what they call them, to take responsibility and actually provide restitution to the victim. And they use it in Longmont. They use it for violent crimes, and they've had great success. Their crime rates are super low, so they have a deterrence effect. They have a very low recidivism rate, and they don't destroy people's lives in the process. So I look at these things and I say, look, if the two top reasons why women seek abortion are poverty and bad relationships. And that might be because they don't know how to balance a checkbook, or they haven't gotten themselves a good job, or they've gotten wrapped up in drug use, or whatever it is. Restorative justice is actually an opportunity to not only help them see the harm that they've caused in their action and take responsibility for it, but they're given an opportunity to actually make recompense, but also ensure that doesn't happen again. And the way the system works, the restorative justice system works in Longmont, Colorado, is it is outside the state apparatus. So you have police, you have courts, those still exist up there. But if there are certain conditions met, then you can take the restorative justice route, and that is a private organization that walks you through this process that they have, and that it's very successful. So when I think about enforcement for abortion, it would be one of those two: restorative justice or tort law.
Well, yeah. So someone asked, how would tort law apply to when there's no economic harm or there's no damage to something that belongs to someone else?
So, Yeah, that's a good question. Um, there's any number of ways that can sort of be calculated. And one of the features of libertarianism is that the victim gets to have a say in, what they would consider restitution. Um, and that can be, so maybe they're naming a price. Maybe this is a father who didn't want his wife to have an abortion, and maybe he doesn't want monetary compensation. He wants her to make some sort of change. That's an opportunity for something else. The point is not to say here's a dollar amount on fetal life or here's a dollar amount on human life. It has to do with, and in this case, in a tort situation, it would be a family member who is acting on behalf of the fetus, who's saying, "Hey, this is, you committed a crime, and we want compensation for that." So it's hard to say what the dollar amount would be, and restorative justice is a good alternative to situations where somebody can't actually pay a monetary compensation. Restorative justice focuses a lot on how, maybe they can perform a service, or maybe they can, go to therapy, or maybe they can, do community service or whatnot. There's any number of ways that they can go about providing restitution, but that's something that's worked out between the responsible party, the offender, and the victim.
All right. Well, we've gone for, by the time we wrap up, we'll be approaching our normal time. What would you want to say in summation, or where would you point people to learn more about, again, I'm glad we didn't really get into the rape and incest thing, because I think often that's a smokescreen and a distraction in all this. It's not to say that it's unimportant, but it's such a small percentage of these things. I think the overarching issue of life and liberty for the unborn child, the 99% of them, it can be, it's pretty clear. But how would you sum up? What do you want to leave? Of course, not everyone agrees, not everyone understands, and that's fine. You didn't expect that, and we didn't. But where would you steer people, and what would you leave them with?
I would say, first of all, it's a paradigm shift. Thinking about this in libertarian terms is a paradigm shift, because we're accustomed to thinking about the state and civil governance and crime and punishment in particular ways.
And political party binaries.
Yes.
We have this policy, they have this policy.
Yeah.
That's all.
I would say libertarianism is absolutely interested in justice, true justice, and getting restoration for crimes, or restitution for crimes. My particular emphasis with the abortion issue is that we can resolve the human rights question, and not only uphold the rights of the unborn, but also the rights of women. I've pointed out, and I won't say too much about the rape thing. There's not a lot of time, but I do want to say this. One reason why I think that our criminal justice system doesn't actually take rape very seriously as a violent crime. It's the one violent crime where the victim can be accused of inviting it, and there's a whole slew of problems when it comes to it. But I think one reason why there's injustice in our criminal justice system when it comes to the rape issue is because of the prevalence of abortion. And I mentioned this in my debate with Walter Block. When in the rape question, when our focus becomes on the baby, then the rapist gets out the back door, proverbially speaking, maybe even literally speaking. So we are letting the rapist off the hook for that crime. My libertarian theory that I am proposing, this is I'm writing a paper on this for peer review, is suggesting that, or asserting that, rights begin at conception, that you don't actually have exceptions for abortion for life, um, for health, for rape, for incest. You don't have these exceptions written into it. Um, that's probably a stronger stance than the conventional pro-life perspective. I take a different tact when it comes to enforcement and punitive action. I'm looking at what will actually produce deterrence, what will actually lower recidivism, so that she's not making that decision again. Um, so not throwing the book down, so to speak, on her just for the sake of throwing it down. If you want to know more, I've done a lot of work on it already. Yes, it's hard to summarize, especially to people who are not familiar with libertarianism. But if you do want to uh, look at more of my work, you can go to my website. It's mereliberty.com/abortion. And that's my page that has everything on it, articles that I've written, interviews I've done, the debate that I had with the Walter Block is on there. All of that's on there. And if you have questions, you can always email me, Kerry at mereliberty.com, or follow me. But yeah, it is a paradigm shift, and it takes some thinking through. But I think that in the end, it's coherent. I think it resolves this question of rights between women and offspring. And I think that we can actually find true justice in the midst of that.
All right. Well, that's this is another perspective. It's as you say, it's this is a long view, I think. In the meantime, are you one of those people who could not celebrate the overturn of Roe and condemned everyone who did, or were you actually happy that law was overturned?
No, I'm happy that Roe was overturned. It needed to be overturned. It was bad, not just for the unborn, but for women as well. It needed to be overturned. I think that I'm a little bit skeptical about how it's going to play out as far as state level laws. I think that there is a bad way to go about enforcing abortion prohibition that can come back and bite us in the butt. So I'm cautious when it comes to that. But I do think that what we're looking at in America is going to be a split. You're going to have roughly half the states that ban abortion at some point. It's looking like 6 weeks. And then half the country is going to keep it legal and maybe even expand upon it. And it's going to create an interesting dynamic that I think can only be answered if we're willing to look at the economic aspects of this. And so my goal is end the practice of abortion, whether it's ending the legal practice of abortion in states where it's still legal, or ending the voluntary practice of it in economic terms. That's my goal, is to do that.
Yeah, I think that's helpful to say that, and you're realistically accepting that it's going to be legal in some states, and that some of the things you've talked about could reduce it even then.
Yes,
even in a legal, and even in a pro-abortion legal environment, the things that you the ideas you're advocating, and even the strategies could help there. So.
Yeah, in that book, Faith Seeking Freedom, I actually have in that chapter on abortion, I discuss a strategy for whether abortion is legal or not. And CPCs play a huge role in that. CPCs actually strongly outnumber the number of abortion clinics in America. So
that's crisis pregnancy centers. Yes.
Yes. So, and that's part of the economic element. So yes, absolutely. I think it's good to overturn Roe. Casey, Planned Parenthood versus Casey was also overturned. It's good to overturn those things. Those were bad case law, bad for the unborn, bad for women. But, at the state level, we need to be asking questions about enforcement. Are those enforcement measures going to create new injustices? Because the war on drugs certainly did, and these tough on crime policies don't work. So we need to be asking questions about that. And then asking questions about, are we really protecting the unborn by simply prohibiting essentially the sale of the service of abortion at 6 weeks and beyond? Is that really pro-life? Because I would take a much stronger stance on that.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us again. It's refreshing to have a guest that doesn't have a beard or a mustache. We like that. We need that every now and then. And I'm sure this is not the last time we'll talk to you. And if it only serves to make people look into some of these ideas a little more, maybe explore. And again, I'm personally not advocating for a political party, but the principles of liberty. And most Reformed people are kind of geeky, and there are a lot of Reformed people who are attracted to libertarianism. But even if you're not, considering some of these ideas can be helpful, especially in the years to come, because we're sort of I think we're on a knife edge where we're going to become much more under the thumb of government, or maybe much, much freer in the next decade or so. But well, we'll see. That's not up to us necessarily, even in a representative democracy, republic, whatever we live in at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks, and you've given your contact information. Everyone can check you out. So, thanks. Resby, are you with us?
Of course, I'm with you. I'm the voice of your conscience.
That's right. Oh boy, I can do
when
anything.
When you wonder if you should do something, I'm the voice that speaks to you.
Yes. Well, but we'll let you say goodnight to our friends.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for watching or listening. If this is after the fact, thank you, Kerry, for coming on and talking through everything. Yeah. Join us on Twitter. Comment along. We love it. @PresbyCast. As you debate all of these things with your family members and ruin holidays. Remember, don't be an Erdman.
Painter of a million pictures, composer of 1,000 themes, author of every well-chosen word, essence of all our dreams, essence of all our dreams.
Magic on the internet worldwide.